Hey everybody, my name's Luca, and today I'm joined by,
Daniel Karakov. Hi.
and we talked a little bit before, talking about some issues we wanted to get into. So I think we both have a couple of notes written down, but I kind of want this to be a free flowing conversation, and I'm just looking for like around an hour. If it goes more than that, if it goes less than that, I'm not really too pressed. I only have like time commitments later on, and I don't think this conversation is going to go like more than 3 hours. So I think we are good. And so I know kind of the first conversation we had was about my original video, the first one that I published about defunding the police. And I know you wrote a really good Google Doc about that, which I really appreciate because I know every time that I watch like political content or anything that I disagree with, the first thing I want to do is like write a little document and get some notes down. So if you want to start with that, we can just, if you want to bring up like a couple of points from there, and then we can discuss a little bit about that. And I know we also wanted to talk about political language, which is something that I've been having some thoughts about too. So I think we'll have a good back and forth. But if you want to kind of start and give yourself a little opening introduction, kind of giving your political beliefs. I feel like people who've watched some of the videos on my channel kind of know what I'm feeling, but obviously they're not as familiar with your point of view. So if you want to start off, and then we'll just get going.
Sure. Okay. Well, I haven't pulled up the Google Doc about the police video, but my thoughts on police are basically, it would not to take a long time to talk about it, but um, this movement, is not, it's not a marketing campaign. It's not branded effectively so that like in the political sphere, it's the thing that's best suited to of deflect arguments against it and things like that. It
Mm-hmm.
is provocative, it is extreme, um, and it's totally like policy focused. So it opens itself up to a lot of criticism that way, which can be a criticism of the movement itself, that it isn't smarter with the way it messages, the way it brands
Yeah.
itself.
And for people who don't have context, we're talking about the defund the police movement, which is kind of relevant still today, but I say especially like a couple months or like maybe like 1 or 2 months ago, but it's still going on today. But
Yeah.
just for people who don't know, we're talking about the defund the police movement. And I made a video about that. So if you want full context, you might want to go check out that video too. But I mean, yeah, I guess it's fair to say that it's not really a branded movement, but I would kind of disagree when you say that it is a policy focused movement. Like, it is true that defunding the police is a policy, but I'd argue that it's such an unspecific policy that even if we did defund the police, it's very, very possible that we wouldn't actually get any of the outcomes that we would want to see if we defunded the police. Like, just defunding the police, I think, is ignoring a lot of the core issues about why policing is so backwards and so screwed up in America. That I feel like if we just focus on this, we're missing the forest for the trees, if that makes sense. And that's kind of what my video
Yeah,
is about.
I totally understand that perspective, and that actually sort of relates to the sort of stuff that we're planning on talking about as well, because it's all about sort of the way politics is conducted, theoretically, and the way politics happens in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Defund the police is the slogan of the movement. It's not the entire substantive, you know, body. But then there's lots of disagreement about what exactly
Yeah.
should be on the flip side of that coin. Because obviously, defunding the police, uh, I wouldn't say it's non-specific in the sense that it doesn't specify in the slogan what you're going to be doing instead
Mm-hmm.
of spending that money on police. The only thing that's nailed down and set in stone is that some amount of money is going to be taken. And typically, defund implies 100%, but not everyone in the movement.
Mm-hmm.
I would say probably most people in the movement are not in favor of 100% of the funding being taken away from police.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, just the focus on defunding is kind of my core issue with the movement. I really don't think that just defunding the police would really achieve anything at all. And I feel like the police, if you said, like, if you made a specific demand, you're like, we want these police budgets to reduce by 25%. I feel like you'd have to make it much more specific than that. Like, we want this specific area of the police defunded by this amount. Because if you give the general notion of defund the police, it's like, well, which areas are they going to defund? And I feel like there hasn't been a good body of evidence in the US that police forces that have undergone defunding have actually given better outcomes. And I know a lot of people like to cite I think it was in New Jersey where there's a good political article about how like, oh, this one state defunded their police and then it completely worked. But what they did is, and I guess you could argue this as a good reform thing, is they like restructured their police. So they made a more localized police force. So they basically switched from city police to more localized sheriff forces. And then from that, they kind of did a restructuring of their police force. And they did get lower uses of force and kind of the things that people were wanting. But their police budgets did actually increase as a result of that. So my whole argument is that we shouldn't even care about the amount of funding that police get. We need to look at other more policy focused solutions that would actually target the issues that are causing police to be so bad. I just don't really care about the monetary amount that the police are getting. I just don't know if that's important because, I mean, I'm not a fiscal conservative. If we have to spend twice as much on police to get lower uses of force, to get less people arrested for like small petty drug offenses, then like I don't see why we wouldn't want to do that. It seems like the defund the police thing it's more of like a moralized stance almost, and maybe that's a little uncharitable, but it seems like people just want there to be no police, and anything less than that is just, it's just a compromise that they don't want to engage in.
Yeah, it's very. So you brought up a lot of good points. I think it's true that it is morally grounded, like a lot of the social movements that are sort of burgeoning right now. The Camden example is great because a lot of people bring it up or have heard about it to some extent, and they think it supports their side or another side of the argument. You can't see my hands at all. I'm using hand gestures all the time. Camden did not defund its police. It broke the police union and then restructured the police. But Camden is not a success story. There is basically no defund the police success story because it wasn't even on the table until a couple months ago.
Yeah.
You mentioned, you don't care how much money goes to the police.
To a reasonable extent.
To an extent, of course.
Yeah.
I'm not you're saying it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah.
But the question of, what are the police doing with the money and how could it be better used is a very important question, because people are not going to all turn into modern monetary theorists overnight. And for clarification, modern monetary theory is sort of a name given to this like small camp of economists that basically argue that debt on a federal level doesn't matter very much because the US basically is always going to be in debt and no one is ever going to come collect, at least not in the relevant
What's your
future.
take? What's your take on MMT? I'm curious.
I haven't studied it enough really to actually know, but generally, both sides basically use debt as a political bludgeon to say, you're raising the deficit. You're raising the deficit. But it's basically a gift to political conservatives who want to attack the welfare state. I mean, the welfare state is basically non-existent in the United States as it is. But to attack anything, that the government allocates money to on the grounds that it, raises the deficit, but both parties raise the deficit.
Yeah, I mean, Republicans kind of attack issues that raise the deficit if they're issues they're disagreeing with. I mean, if Trump is pushing, an increased military budget, the deficit hawks are going to be pretty silent on that issue. But God forbid we try to expand the ACA or try to make food stamps less terrible, then that's when the deficit and debt really, really matter. But I mean, I can kind of agree with some of modern monetary theory just because, and again, I haven't studied it either. My knowledge about this theory is pretty limited, but I do somewhat agree that debt definitely doesn't matter as much as a lot of people make it out to be. It seems to me that almost every nation is always going to be in debt because that's just kind of how the global economy works. Like we're constantly buying products from, like we have a huge trade deficit from China, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. That just means that we are trading more with China. Like we're buying more products from them than they're giving to us, obviously. But like, is that really a bad thing? We're getting a lot cheaper products. This opens up other more efficient, areas in the economy to produce better, cheaper goods. So I don't know. I do get annoyed when I hear a lot of like, budget hawk, deficit hawk kind of rhetoric, especially coming from the American conservative right. But I think debt is something that needs to be managed as long as we're able to service it rather, and not become Greece where we just borrow too much money and then our economy goes bust. But it seems like if the U.S. government really wants to implement a policy or really wants to push something, it seems like we're able to afford it almost every time. Like no one's really clamoring budgets when we go to war in the Middle East. It seems like you were saying earlier, it's more of a political bludgeon than it is actually a reality. But I don't know enough about modern monetary theory to be honest.
I know that Stephanie Kelton, who like really is like the forefront or the face of the movement, is a reputable economist. And other economists like Paul Krugman have also
Mm,
suggested that debt is overblown as sort of a worry for people to have. But I'm not entirely sure that I'm in love with the idea of modern monetary theory, besides it raising the argument that politics, economics, and politics are so closely intertwined that, maybe people's instinctive fear of debt is more of a political thought than an economic thought.
yeah, I
Um,
would definitely agree with that. Yeah, because I think a part of modern monetary theory is also just that money in itself is it's basically just being able to be printed by the government at almost no cost because the government basically has a monopoly on the money that they print. So shouldn't they be able to just print however much money they want and not really receive any negative benefits? That's kind of the idea behind it as far as I
well,
understand.
no one is suggesting that inflation doesn't happen when
Yeah,
you
yeah, of course,
increase
of
the amount
course.
of money. Um, but the problem is that, like, well, this is another thing Krugman said, and I'm not like, I don't actually like Paul Krugman, but he is acclaimed economist, very partisan, but an acclaimed economist. And he
Mhm.
said that inflation is also basically a boogeyman that people are overly afraid of. A little inflation might even be good. This is sort of a Keynesian idea.
Yeah.
I don't know if we need to get into Keynesian economics, but you know, have a little inflation in there to stimulate the economy. It'll go back down on its own after we stimulate the economy back up from wherever pit it's fallen into. That's
Yeah.
basically the idea of it. And then it's sort of a political argument. Like, does it work? In practice, we've seen it work.
Yeah.
But politically, it's very effective to allege that you're just throwing money into a pit and that's a waste, so that you can gain power. And that's really what I think the conversation about political language is really going to be focused around as well, because, are you interested in actually knowing the best thing to do in terms of facts? You starting with your principles and then using the facts to achieve your goals, or is it actually just a totally cynical means to try to grab power?
Mhm. So did you want to segue into political language then? Did you have something you kind of wanted to start this conversation off, or I had some things that I was thinking we could start it off if you don't have anything, but because you were kind of the one who brought up the topic, I'll give you the first shot if you want to start off with something.
Well, we can totally start with whatever thoughts you wanted to start with. That's fine.
Well, I was thinking, well, how about this? What would you consider your political leanings? Like if you could give, what's the most approximate phrase that you would use to identify how you feel about just the world politically?
Right. So the danger in ascribing a political ideology to yourself is a lot of people will, look at you differently after you ascribe one. And one of the things I was going to talk about with political language is this idea of political geography, the idea of there being a left, right, or an up, down, anything like that. Um, and one of the things I think about it, which is not necessarily entirely a critique, is that it's reductive. It oversimplifies the reality of things. So where am I politically? I'm left for sure, and what that means, we'll get to. And depending on your definition, I could be very moderate or very extreme. And I'm not just saying that as a cop out.
Yeah.
I mean, I do reflect on this, and it's an established theme or trend or whatever.
Yeah.
And then in terms of size of government, I'm kind of a more decentralized, smaller government type
Okay.
person.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I really like the term political geography. I don't know if I've ever heard that or used that before, but I think that's a great way to try to put a term to the political compass, the right, the left spectrum. Because I cannot tell you how many times I've had a conversation. What was it? Just the other day, I was talking about like I think I was talking about healthcare with a couple of friends, and we were talking about how most countries are to the right or are to the left of the U.S. in terms of healthcare, and then we kind of talked about are most countries to the left of the U.S. like in aggregate, and I was thinking in terms of like policy, I'd say most countries, most developed countries, to be clear, like Germany, France, Japan, just your
OECD.
OECD, yeah, your OECD countries. They're probably mostly to the left of the US in policy. But then I started thinking, I'm like, is a country like Japan, could I really consider Japan more left wing than the US when they have some of the tightest immigration standards? They focus very much on like ethnic homogeneity in their society. Like these are not left wing ideas. So when we try to only talk about politics on a right to left spectrum, yeah, it seems like a terrible place to start political discourse. But I mean, it's not always a bad jumping off point, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of dangers with going into um, geography like that, saying, is this left or is this right? Or the more general you go, the harder it gets to really
Yep.
be clear. Because first you can make a very simple division into like social versus economic,
Yeah,
which
just the
already sort
political
of,
compass. Yep.
it's kind of a false dichotomy that it's either social or economic
Yeah.
already. But then if you just go plain and simple left versus right, that's even more confusing. So there's kind of no way to win. Um, so for sure, like almost every OECD country has things that it does for its people that the US does not do for its people. And that's a common way to differentiate left and right.
Yeah.
So, like, homelessness rates, highest in the US of any OECD country, imprisonment rates, super high in the US. Welfare state, by far the smallest in the US.
That's so
But
we were both in
that's
the
actually a
same
sticking point.
but we were both in the same PLCP like three I don't remember the name, but we were in the same political economy of the welfare state class, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you would consider the US's welfare state to be small then?
Well, that's what I was going to say as a sticking point is that, one of the first things we covered in that class is actually that it's not small.
Yeah, yeah.
But in terms of, people's understanding of what a welfare state is, sort of I don't know, a partisan understanding or a layperson's understanding of what welfare state means,
Hmm.
which is often it's a pejorative phrase like you want to give welfare.
Yeah, you want
It's
handouts
like,
from the government?
yeah,
You can't
entitlement,
yeah, you can't just,
all these different,
work by yourself and become successful.
yeah. So in that sense, in terms of basically how much money is redistributed to the poor in America, it's much lower. But in terms of an overall welfare state, the government sort of trying to increase people's welfare, no matter who it is, yeah, we spend a lot of money. And a lot of people, it's sort of hidden. That was one of the
Yeah.
first points that the
Yeah.
professor in that class made.
In tax expenditures and other corporate kind of welfare.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
one of the graphs that kind of made me the angriest when talking about just the U.S.'s welfare and healthcare, system was the graph of public versus private spending in OECD countries when it comes to healthcare, because the U.S.'s public spending is at basically the same level as percentage of GDP than all the comparable countries, but our private spending is just so far removed from any other countries, and our outcomes are just not better like equivalently. Like that graph just makes me so angry because I'm like, we're already spending the amount that other countries are doing, we're just doing it in such an inefficient way that it's just screwing over the tens of millions of people who are uninsured in this country.
yeah, there's just a huge disconnect between like political, the political language, the ideological conflict, that people sort of connect with directly, and then there's like the policy side where everyone understands that a system like there's lots of different systems in Europe, but any of the systems in Europe work more efficiently. They achieve the stated goals of what welfare is supposed to be a lot better
Hmm.
than the way the US does things.
Yeah.
So
No,
it's really tricky.
one thing that I think I have learned about politics, the more I learn about politics, is that policy, especially in a more, democratic state that the US is, policy is not really based off of stats and data and what's actually most efficient. It's really just based off of what do the people of the country think is like the best idea, which I guess is somewhat reductive when I'm talking about democracy, but policy is truly not guided by, like economics and actual data about the matter. It's truly governed by like what do people think is the right idea. And that's a good thing, but it also leads us to a lot of bad outcomes like the healthcare system that we have.
For sure, where people, want to look for the answers to questions that they have is a value question. It's not a science question.
Hmm.
Science can't tell us, what should we look at, what should we study, and what way should we study it.
Yeah, who should we
Those are
help?
those are all those are all value questions. Yeah, ethics questions, cannot really be answered by science. Well, that's debatable, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Everything is debatable eventually, but
Hmm.
in a basic sense, there is this real difficulty in trying to get everybody to sit down at the table and agree on ethics.
Hmm.
But that's sort of that's really what politics is about, at least in my belief. And that is sort of a point that I like to evangelize about because not everyone agrees with that. That politics is a subfield of ethics, and that you
Hmm.
should start with ethics when deciding what political beliefs you want to have.
Yeah, and yeah, like I said, I agree with a lot of that sentiment. Just because like laws are very literally the way that our society creates ethics, in a government. A lot of, like our murder laws and stuff, they're not, they're geared after like what law do we consider worse in society? Which which murder here, which of these should incur more of a prison sentence because we feel like we need to do more against the people who have perpetrated these offenses. So yeah, I'd say there's a lot of importance in looking at politics through a moral lens, but I'd also argue that I think a lot of the moral issues in politics can be argued through an amoral, more data heavy approach, which can be very useful when arguing with someone who just completely has a different like moral worldview than yourself.
Hmm. But if they have a different moral worldview, then saying, this data shows that we can achieve my goal most efficiently through this means only works if they actually agree with your value that you're holding.
Yeah, to some extent, but like maybe I'll give like an example. Like if you're trying to argue, yeah, I guess if it's completely like a moral opposition, then you kind of have to argue from the moral basis. But I think like a lot of people they argue from a moral position, but that may not actually be what they really care about. Like just like arguing the morals of healthcare. Like if someone is so set in the idea that people who can't afford it genuinely don't deserve to have healthcare, that kind of strict father mentality where, you just literally don't deserve this benefit, then maybe it's hard to convince them. But I would also argue that like if you can show this person that it'll cost you less and it will cost the government less, like it'll be more cost efficient for anyone, would their moral like imperative that people don't deserve healthcare, would they still like would they be willing to say I rather have a less in a less efficient, more costly system because of my moral paradigm? Like I just don't know. I think you can convince someone who disagrees with you morally using data. Like I think you could say the same with immigration. Like I do think a lot of people they might actually start with like I guess it depends too. If they start with the moral argument or if they start with the data argument and then they bring the moral elements in separately, then I guess it kind of depends how you can argue with people. If that
Right.
makes
Well,
sense.
I believe that whether it's ethics or scientific fact, whatever you want to call it, it's knowledge regardless. So moral knowledge, is knowledge just the same way that, knowing how far the sun is from the earth is knowledge.
Mhm.
And so growing that, is always a plus in my mind. And, you know, it's never so simple as you have a value, and then that value tells you that you should believe you should support this policy. I wish it was that simple,
Yeah, it would be
but
nice.
no one really even consciously tries to figure out their principles. Even, I mean, I would say that's uncommon to actually try to sit down and say, you know, what exactly are my, what's my political philosophy? You know, it's more like, we already know we hold it, so it's not really necessary. And it's also hard to try to glean what your political philosophy is. But, the idea that, so there's two things about it that I think are most important. One is the principles that you actually hold, and then the other one is sort of the prioritization. So which principles are more important to you than others? And that's really where I think the problem is, because not to sound all like hippie and, kumbaya, everyone handshaking and
Yeah,
dancing
yeah.
together or whatever, but I think most people are good. I think almost everyone is good. Everyone at least always acts, or almost always acts, in a way that they think is just on some level,
Mm-hmm.
either directly just, like I'm doing the right thing, or I'm doing the wrong thing but for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that even if you're a moral relativist, which I am not and I don't agree with, but even if you think, oh, well, we just happen to have these values because we're trained to in society, well, most everyone is trained pretty much the same way. So that
Hmm.
that reflects itself in I mean, there are some things that we don't, there's some things that we don't at least say we don't disagree on, right?
So,
So
so
no one is going to come out and say, I support murder.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
when you say everyone is trained in the same way, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I might disagree completely, or I might actually agree once you finish elaborating.
Well, the way that people are sort of socialized is really important. So by far the most important part of how you develop values and a sense of ethics comes from your immediate environment. So your family members most often, and like media that especially when you're young and developing and
Mm-hmm.
your ideas are formulating. So your teachers, your classmates, because most people, especially very young, they're either in public school or private school, but still, like the messages you get taught are pretty simple, and pretty universal, at least on the merits, right? Like you're not going to go to a private school that's going to teach you a wildly different ethical story about the world than a public school. And the reason for that is because both of them are very interested in staying apolitical, which is funny, right? And
Mm.
so, you will there are differences, sure. It's not going to be explicit. It's never going to be, we're training you to have these ethical beliefs, but everything is sort of a type of training program in that sense. So
Yeah.
that's
See, I agree with a lot of the claims you're making, but I still don't know if I agree with the original claim that everyone is kind of trained the same. Like, I'd argue that, yeah, obviously there's no private schools teaching, students such radically different beliefs than the one that we all generally hold, that, like, you shouldn't steal people's stuff, you shouldn't kill people. Not these extremes, but like I'm a pretty hardcore determinist when it comes to things. Like, and I think that's also why I agree with what you're saying earlier. Like, is everyone good? I believe that. I do believe that almost everybody is acting in a way that they think would, be the most beneficial, maybe for themselves, maybe for society as a whole. And some of these people I radically agree with, but I do think that everyone does think that they are doing the good thing, right? Like, I feel like that's how everyone views everything they do. I don't know if anyone is necessarily making decisions. To some extent, they do, but on like the big issues, I don't think people are really making decisions that they consciously know, like, oh, these are bad policies that I'm voting for. Like, that seems like it's just not the case. But like,
exactly.
if someone is not, like, I would argue that someone who goes to a public school versus a private school, obviously depending on the area, depending on their income level, depending on their background, they could actually, say graduate high school with completely radically different beliefs on, like, almost everything, right? Like, if someone is growing up in a very wealthy neighborhood and goes to a top private school in their city or state, they're going to have a very specific worldview that someone who grows up in a low income public school area is not going to have. Yeah, maybe they're both going to agree that murder is wrong, but their voting patterns are going to be significantly different. Their,
Sure.
political
Yeah.
philosophy and their principles and their prioritization, or then their prioritization, these are all going to be very, very different from one another. And I think that all has to do with like the environment that they're raised in. And yeah, that's kind of my worldview because, and like I said earlier, I extend that to like the good beliefs or the good people versus bad people thing. I think like the worst people are probably the worst people because they were in the worst environment, but that doesn't abstain them from making the world the worst place. If you understand, if you get what I'm saying.
I totally get what you're saying, and it's super relevant to the conversation. And I want to say I actually agree. And really, what I was trying to say when I said like this is my like kumbaya moment,
Mm-hmm.
is that this is sort of like it's a value judgment, and it's almost a faith claim in a way, which is that this is sort of a way of thinking about ethics that I didn't express out loud, but it came through what I was saying, which is that there is levels to it, or a geography almost of it, where like at the foundation, at the bottom, you have very basic values like I shouldn't hurt people, and then how they translate up into everyday ethics. What should I eat for breakfast this morning? In this gulf in between it, there's so much other stuff
Mm-hmm.
that it makes it so complicated. But there's this idea that's very tempting, and I don't think it's real. But I like to hope that people could make it real or something like that, which is that this foundational stuff is actually foundational, implying that it informs everything else going up the ladder. Which again, like I said, I don't think it's real. I don't think it's true.
Are you kind of talking about natural rights almost?
Well, sir, a belief in natural rights is something that if you asked anyone in America, almost everyone would say that they agree with them. But then, so that's a very basic, fundamental
What do you think?
agreement. Do I think that in practice, do they believe in them?
No, do
I
you
mean,
think that natural rights is that like a concept that you agree with? And
oh, natural rights, no.
yeah, yeah. I
Um,
disagree with it. I disagree with it entirely.
I mean, I disagree with it not because I don't think people have rights, but because I think that we have to give them to people,
Yeah.
and we're not giving them to
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
The idea of natural rights I think is it's almost like a I'm not going to find the right
it's
word
a
for it,
faith
but
claim.
it
It's a faith belief.
it
It's
I
it's
guess
God.
it is a
God
faith.
gives you the right.
Yeah, yeah. It's mostly intertwined with faith claims. I definitely agree with that. But yeah, like rights don't really exist without a government to enforce these rights. So just saying that natural rights are a thing, I think it's mostly a way that you can just hand wave government policy, say like oh, or just restrict government policy. I think in a way as well.
It definitely can be used in that way, and it can also be a way to say, it's also in a way it's a shorthand for just having a belief in a sort of objective morality.
Yeah,
I don't know if we should use the word objective for a lot of reasons, right?
yeah,
Because not everyone's going to agree, but also, it's not exactly that it's an object. I don't personally believe that there is some sort of intangible object of what is right and wrong out there. But I do think that you can nonetheless be right and wrong about what is right and wrong.
yep,
You know what I
yeah.
mean?
I know what you mean. I know
I
what you
don't
mean.
think it's just all relative, and like we're all just, trying our best or something. I think that it is real. Yeah.
So earlier, you're talking about your own kind of political perspective, and you said that you are on the left, but you also believe in a more decentralized, almost smaller government. And I actually have a lot of issues with the whole small government versus big government political geography, I guess you'd say. And then you were also talking about how, we have our principles and then we have our priority. Do you think you would just, like, I guess what I'm asking is like, what do you think if you were able to, summarize your political philosophy a little further than I'm on the left and I believe in a more decentralized government? What would, if you could kind of summarize like your main principles and kind of what priority they are, what would that be? And I think we could kind of study that almost as like a use of political language too.
Yeah, I could actually explain it in a extremely patriotic American values sort of
All right,
language,
nice, nice.
or I could explain it in a completely un-American, you know, radical language. Let me see. I think I have an American flag right here to wave. Oh, it's somewhere else. I don't know where it is. I was gonna use
I'll
it
just
to
edit one
cover
in.
the
Don't
like.
worry. Don't worry.
Yeah, just have a banner flying behind me,
Yeah.
waving in the breeze.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like the American values one because it's sort of it makes it hard to argue against.
Mhm. Mhm.
You instead of having to say that's un-American and you can just shut down, instead you have to say that's actually not right about what Americanism is or
Mhm.
what American values
Then
are.
you actually have to engage with the ideas and not just say, "Oh, you hate America. You're a neoliberal or a neo-Marxist, postmodernist, or whatever." But
Yeah,
yeah,
anything
so
like that.
so you want to give your patriotic American pitch for your political philosophy then?
Sure. So I'm a Republican Democrat. Republican in the sense like the founding fathers believed that everyone should be the master of their own destiny, and a Democrat in the sense that I think both that it's the right thing to do morally and also that it's just the
That
most
democracy
efficient
is the right
way.
thing to do?
Yeah. And that in terms of efficiency, it's the best way to translate people's beliefs and values into
Mhm.
policy. So, in that sense, this is liberalism in a way of arguing it. Not liberalism in the sense that a believer in the Democratic Party, but liberalism in the sense of, you could say, classical liberalism, or you could just say philosophical liberalism, because the term liberalism is basically like probably the most contested term in all of
Yeah.
political
Yeah.
philosophy,
Yeah.
because it's the dominant philosophy of the world, and almost all the powerful parties, all the power seekers, at least say that they believe in it,
Yeah.
maybe without naming it liberalism, but they say they believe in
What
the
do you think
values that
what
we
do you think
call
is the
liberalism.
best definition for liberalism? How would you
Oh
define
God.
it? How would you define it? For yourself, for yourself. You don't have to speak for the world and parties at large. I know that's an impossible definition.
Yeah, yeah. So for me, liberalism sort of is an ideology that's always been at war with itself. There've always been, you know, there's so much fighting over what it means. The only thing you can really say about liberalism that's mostly hard to disagree with is that liberalism has representative democracy, and liberalism supports rule of law rather than rule of a ruler,
Mhm.
and that the idea of it is that the government is tolerant. So this is the liber part of liberal, just that it's sort of freedom oriented, and the goal of it is sort of to give people as much freedom as we can without hurting anyone's rights or without infringing on the law.
Yeah.
Basically, is the idea of it. So
So,
that's what I would say.
okay. So, when people talk about political freedom, if you ask a libertarian what it means to be free politically, what they're going to tell you is it means that the government can't come in my house and tell me what to do. But if you ask someone, I guess I'd consider myself a social democrat, but like we were talking before, political labels and stuff, these are all not the best ways to approximate your beliefs. But like my conception of freedom would be like, what do people have the freedom to do? Do people have the freedom to get the job that they believe that, they, or not that they believe, that they actually have the skills for? Do they have the freedom to go and get the education for the field they want to work in? That's how I kind of would define freedom. So I guess and because you did mention that you are more about decentralized, smaller government. So which conception of freedom, or do you have your own definition that you think is different from either of those? Do you think that you believe?
Freedom is so complicated. It is it is horribly complicated, right? So there is sort of a general idea of freedom to and freedom from, and the idea is that American libertarianism since the 70s has said freedom from is the important thing, and
Mm-hmm.
freedom to, um, you're free to grab that if you want, and we're free not to have to give it to you. Is
Yeah.
the is And in a sense, libertarianism has claimed a sort of almost scientific consistency to their philosophy, which is it's always just freedom from. The guy who came up with it called them side constraints. Freedom
Mm-hmm.
is a side constraint. It's not a very good term, frankly. But the idea is that you have all these freedoms from things. You have freedom from unjust taxation, which for a libertarian is probably almost any taxation at all.
Yeah.
Some of them it's any at all.
Mm-hmm.
But the theoretically rigorous libertarianism does have a government. It is not
Yeah.
anarchism or anarchy. It is there is a government, and it's only spending money on things that we know are just, and
Yeah.
everything else is just a total free for all. But there are a lot of sort of assumptions packed in with that.
Yeah.
So we could talk about freedom for like 10
Yeah.
years without exhausting all the topics you could
Yeah.
talk about. But my freedom is sort of, I think that freedom to and freedom from as ideas are sort of shaky because, people arguing against anyone who starts talking about people having the freedom to do things say it's a slippery slope. When are you going to stop?
Hmm.
Are we just going to take all of rich people's money? Is there not going to ever be allowed for people to be successful anymore?
Hmm.
So arguments like that get raised a lot, and it's just not. These are very familiar lines of argument that people go down, and I prefer to sort of destabilize the argument so people can look at things in a new way.
Hmm.
So for me, oh, you want to?
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of touch on that a little bit. I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine who's probably a little bit more. Yeah, I'd say he's libertarian politically, and we were talking about mandated masks in terms of slowing the spread of coronavirus, and he was kind of making the argument that wearing a mask is it's the government restricting your freedom, and then kind of where does that end? Kind of invoking the slippery slope that you're talking about. And I gave him the example that doesn't the government already kind of mandate what clothing that we wear? Like it's illegal just to be naked out in public. You can't just go run around a bunch of elementary schools wearing no clothes at all. So like the government kind of already does put restrictions on the clothing we wear. They're already restricting our freedom. But I'd argue that restriction of freedom kind of makes our society more free. Like if more people have less freedom to not wear a mask, that means less people are going to get coronavirus and die from it and spread it to less people. And I'd say that is a much more important area of freedom that we should focus on instead of like, oh, do I have to put, a cloth covering over my face for a couple of hours if I go out grocery shopping?
Yeah, freedom is a social construct. It's not a measurable. You can't put a Geiger counter next to somebody and say he's 80% free.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
go to someone else and say they're 50%
Yeah.
free. So what freedom means, you can talk about freedom rhetorically in any way you want. Oh, if you're free to not wear a mask, that means I'm not free to go around you without you having a mask on, or with
Exactly.
you having a mask on.
Exactly.
I'm not free to travel to the places I need to go because people are not going to be wearing masks and I'm immunocompromised.
Hmm.
But then they say I'm not free to not wear a mask if I don't want to wear a mask. And it's sort of just a way of talking past each other, you know?
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, that conversation that you had is a pretty common conversation
Yeah.
that people have. And your response to him, which is a good one, I would say, is one that people usually use to critique liberalism, or libertarianism rather, usually from a liberal perspective, broader term liberal.
Hmm. So earlier
Yeah.
you were talking about how you're a Republican Democrat, which I think it's a great term because our parties are those are the tenets of how our political system works. Like their actual names, like republicanism and democracy. Like that's American democracy, or that's just American politics, right? But I'd kind of be curious, how does that translate into actual policy for you? Because when someone generally says that they favor a small decentralized government, this leads to a lot of assumptions about healthcare and the welfare state that I'm pretty sure just from how you've been talking that you wouldn't necessarily agree with. So what's your patriotic American pitch? Say you're talking to a more libertarian conservative person for implementing sort of welfare programs in the way that you would want to from this patriotic point of view.
Right. Okay, that's a hard ask because sort of the territory that it happens a lot in libertarianism, actually, and it happens not so much in the mainstream political discourse, but talking about why we should have things like welfare is something that's kind of hard to do from an American flag toting perspective, just because of the sort of ground that this value system, you could call it patriotism, has carved out is only so large. When you're talking about, welfare, you could say, every American, deserves to not have to worry about if they have health care. You could say it like that.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, our fellow citizens, who believe the same things we do, that, are basically the same as us. They're in our camp, are suffering, and we can help them in a way that's not even that hard for us to do. Arguments like that is the way I would appeal I would
See,
make that appeal.
I
But
would take a very different approach, I guess. If someone was really against, say, healthcare, I guess I would want to know first why they're, or universal healthcare, sorry. I guess I'd first want to know why they would be against it. But my main pitch for them would be just kind of arguing it from a more pragmatic perspective. Like, why is it good that our healthcare is always tied to our employer? Wouldn't it be better if people didn't have to worry about healthcare in terms of employment so that they could move around and have more economic mobility within the workforce? Because then you're kind of covering people who are really staunch capitalists and who want people to be able to work, and people should be paid according to how well they can work and how well they can produce, and you're not necessarily moralizing it too much. But obviously, like, I think morally I just agree with universal healthcare straight up. Like, I don't see why in the richest country in the world we should have people without health insurance. Like, this seems like a completely easy problem to fix. Maybe it's not always the most politically practical problem to fix, but like, if I was arguing with a very patriotic American, it's just kind of like, why wouldn't you want a good welfare state? Like, isn't the entire country better off that people who grow up in poor areas have better education? They aren't malnourished. They have upwards mobility. They're able to get jobs. They're able to get college. And then you're kind of shifting to the discussion, not that welfare is inherently good or bad, but that welfare, is it beneficial or is it detrimental in terms of actual policy outcomes? And then you're almost like forcing them to bring up data, bring up stats, saying like, okay, how has welfare actually worked? If you start the argument in the kind of moral perspective, then it's easy for them to give moral answers like, oh, well, people don't deserve healthcare. People don't deserve welfare. They're lazy. But if you start from the premise that, oh, these things are, if implemented properly, then they will actually give material benefits. And if you can kind of work them into that area, then you have to actually start talking about the specifics and if this policy has actually been helpful or if it's made people lazy and not work.
sure. Well, you challenged me to say how I would
Yeah.
take an American patriotic argument to someone like that. And the American patriotic response to you saying, that the outcomes work better or that it makes better mobility in the workforce or whatever is, no one doesn't change a job because of healthcare, because like pretty much almost every employer will give you healthcare.
Well,
That's why like people aren't revolting in the streets. So like the question is,
well, no,
why
no.
don't
My
you have the
argument.
right to have private healthcare? That's
Well,
why they don't want universal healthcare.
I
It's
would say
because of the
two.
right.
I would say two things. I would say that I'm talking about if someone is working in a job that they have health insurance and they get a job offer from another job, they're going to be fine. They'll be able to transition jobs, have that mobility, and still have healthcare coverage the entire time. But if someone is working at a job and they have healthcare coverage at that job, but they really hate their job, it pays terribly, the working conditions are awful, and there's a couple of jobs in the next city over that they think would be better for them, economically better for them, just in every way possible. I would argue that they would be significantly more discouraged from trying to transition jobs because of the time, because of the period of time that they just would have no healthcare coverage at all. I'd argue that that discourages them from trying to, that just discourages economic mobility. And I'd also argue that countries that do have non-employer tied healthcare systems do see increased amounts of economic mobility. And I'd also argue that someone's right to private healthcare does not have to go away if we move to a universal system. Now,
For sure.
In
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders' plan, Medicare for All, I think he did have somewhere where he wanted to ban private health insurance, which I don't really agree with.
Almost no one does.
Yeah, because Americans overwhelmingly really actually like their private health insurance, the ones who have a decent package. I'll challenge you on that one. If I can pull up some
It
polling data if
depends.
you want, I can pull up some polling data if you want. But Americans do overwhelmingly, at least the data that I've seen, they do actually like their private health insurance because if you are a middle to upper class income earner, your health insurance in America is pretty great. It is pretty great. The problem with the American healthcare system is the amount of people who are uninsured and the amount of people with low income who don't have access to healthcare. At least the way I see it.
Yeah, it's
So I'd
stuff on the
argue that
margins.
to that person, I'd say, yeah, we can still have private health insurance. You can still have the freedom to buy private health insurance, but you can, have a universal system, even a single payer system that still allows for private health insurance. Your freedom is not going to necessarily go
Yeah, I
away. The
mean,
only freedom you lose is you don't have the option to not have healthcare, which like I'd argue that that's not really free, man. If you don't have healthcare, unless you're like the richest person in the world and you can incur any $100,000
well,
medical expense, then maybe.
yeah, no one, yeah, I mean, I don't hold those values, and
Yeah,
I
I
agree
know.
with what you were saying.
Yeah.
But the thing is that, this is like political language at its finest, right? Is that the goalposts can constantly shift, and you can constantly be talking about different things.
Hmm.
So when you raise your points, then someone can say, it's infringing on my freedom for you to raise taxes to fund, you know, a,
Yeah. Yeah.
a public health system. And so that it keeps sort of circling around, and you're not going to convince somebody easily of anything
But see, even
in
that,
general. So that's
I would say, well, the reason that you would not want your taxes raised for a public healthcare system is generally because you think that it's immoral for the government to extract, more of your money without your say in it, right? But I feel like if I could prove to this person that a universal healthcare system would be more cost effective, then the amount of money from their income that they're paying into the healthcare system will be reduced, which would free up even more spending for them and in the economy, and would still get the universal outcome. So I do
yeah.
think that in a lot of these like moral situations, you can kind of like outmoral them with stats. At least I'm hopeful
Well,
with that. At least.
it's more like I like to think, since I believe that there is a right and wrong about right and wrong,
Hmm.
right? So I think that universal healthcare is more right. It's more morally correct. So I
Yeah.
think that more information does just sort of lead people to that conclusion. And universal healthcare sort of came up in conversation, in the political conversation pretty recently, and it became very popular very quickly. And I think it's for that reason, which is that it makes a lot of intuitive moral sense to people.
Yeah.
So yeah, there can be really, really long and frustrating and complicated debates about healthcare and so many other issues
Yeah.
because of the problems with language.
Which I'm
Yeah.
trying to have more of those on this channel because a lot of people try to dodge me when I try to get them to debate or anything like that. People who disagree with me more. But so if like people who would just staunchly disagree with the stuff that we're saying, you gotta tell them to come debate me because I'm trying to get more like I'm trying to get some more bloodthirsty conversations, because this is like my second conversation I've had with like this recording format. I had one yesterday or the day before, and that one was good too. I think these have all been great, but I want to get some like actual debates on this channel, so I'm trying to get
Yeah.
people who actually just hate
Well,
universal healthcare to come on.
you said that you're sort of more skeptical of small government stuff. So that is somewhere where we probably disagree a bit
Well,
more than
in
on
some ways.
healthcare.
So what would your pitch for small government be? Because I agree with some of the sentiment, but continue. Like, give me your pitch real quick,
I
so I
mean,
can know what you're saying.
you can pitch it in a sort of standard philosophical liberalism type of way, which is the government only needs to do
What I mean is,
the minimum.
okay.
You
Maybe I need
know,
to rephrase. Pitch it in terms of what does it mean for actual policy? What is your conception of what's a policy that you would look at and be like, this is too much of a big government policy, and that's why we shouldn't have it.
so corporate welfare,
Okay.
we don't need it.
Okay.
It just gives people money, and the argument is that it infuses the economy with more money.
Are you
But
absolutist about that stance? Like, do you think that it would?
no, I'm not
Yeah.
absolutist about anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
But military spending way too high.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah. But like,
things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess then we probably don't disagree on much. Um, yeah, because when people say small government, I don't know. It's
What do you mean by small government? I
yeah,
think there would.
exactly. Like,
So we have a federal model of
mhm.
government, which is, some people argue that it's the best system ever, invented. A lot of people actually think that federalism is the best system ever invented, and it has a lot of pluses to it. The
Mhm.
problem is actually making it work the way it's advertised to work. That's one of the problems. But for difficulty relating to that and other reasons, I favor a confederal model over a federal model.
Okay.
Basically, the difference is that in a confederation, which is like before the US had a federation, it was a confederation, the Articles of Confederation, for the US history buffs out there. And then Switzerland has a confederation. I don't know if it's still actually technically one or if it's just the name.
I'm
But
half Swiss, so I should know that, but I don't have the answers for you.
yeah. So basically, the idea is the federal government is even weaker, and the states, the constituent states, are even more independent.
Mm.
They have even more power.
Yeah, that's interesting. So like when you say like a Confederate model, what do you think that would look
Not,
like in the
yeah,
U.S.? What do you think that would look like in the U.S.?
immediately invokes, you know, the specter of the Confederacy.
Well, I'm
Um,
not even talking about that. Like, how
I
do you
know we're
think we
not
could
talking
break
about that, but
down the U.S. into a Confederate structure? Like, what kind of regions would you draw? Because I've seen some proposals where, actually, you know, David Pakman, the political commentator.
I've never heard of them.
Okay, well, I was listening to a show one time, and someone called in, kind of giving their a similar pitch to what you're giving, and they were saying we should break the U.S. down into kind of regional quadrants because that would better represent their interests. You'd have like the Northeast, you'd kind of have like the South, the Midwest, you know, the West Coast, and you know, he broke it down in like these specific areas and said that like instead of having one federal government, we just make a couple almost federal governments, which is I guess what a confederacy would be, and that would give more representation to the interests of certain regions instead of just the like national government. So what would you kind of respond to that? Like how do you process that idea?
Well, I sort of look at, first of all, you know, that's centralization in a way rather than decentralization
How
because
so?
you're consolidating multiple states into a federal government
But wouldn't you
that's a
still
smaller level.
yeah, but wouldn't that still be decentralizing it, right? You're taking it instead of having one you know, federal government over all 50 states, you'd have a couple of federal governments that all have power over less states.
In a sense, but also adding a confederation of these sort of regions is another layer of government,
Of course.
right?
Yeah.
So I don't know about that because here's my point about things like that, proposed specific policy proposals like that. Almost any policy proposal can work, and we won't know until we try,
Mhm.
which is part of what makes it so difficult.
Yeah.
Um, I go with policy things based on what I can wager is going to be the most likely system to achieve the goals that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
So how you would get from our federal system to a confederal system is another huge, you know, can of worms
Mhm.
because you don't want to just go straight there because a lot of the problems that we see um, today in politics, you could argue are because of the weakness of federal government versus the states. But I
Mhm.
don't want to threaten the power of states versus the federal government because obviously, you know, I said I believe in a confederal system,
Yeah, but so when you say
you
you
know,
believe in a
so
confederal system, what does that look like for you? If it's not breaking down states by regions and kind of having a federal structure for that, what is a confederal system?
so yeah, so you basically the federal government has a smaller range of powers that it can exert over states, but like a lot of sort of decentralization politics and things like that, you know, you could call it libertarian, you know, if you want to throw out the
Yeah.
implications of right wing politics that libertarianism has. In those kinds of politics, a lot of it sort of depends on, you know, the proper functioning of. There's a lot of conditions that need to be met in order to be able to weaken power in
Yeah.
general, you know,
Yeah.
which is one of the arguments people make for having more centralized power and having larger amounts of power. The federal government already is very powerful. Some people would say, I don't know if confederalism is the right tactic because then the federal government is, you know, constrained in a lot of ways that the federal government can just change the law and give itself a new power, provided the checks and balances don't, you know, prevent that. But
Mhm.
with confederations, it is unless they decide to not have a confederation anymore and all form another confederation, which is what the U.S. did. Um, Within the confederal model, it is constrained in how much power the federal government can ever sort of
Yeah.
grab.
I guess what I'm trying to ask is if you had a magic wand and I could just say you can create the US into whatever confederation system as like whatever possible and it will be completely political viable, like what does that look like? I'm just trying to get an image of like what does your idea of confederation look like as opposed to the current federal structure that we have?
Right. So I mostly would favor a confederation just because we wouldn't need a federal
Well, no,
government
no, I'm
in
not
the
trying to
same
ask.
way.
I'm not trying to ask why a confederation is better. I'm saying what does that look like?
Yeah. So it looks like the federal government is smaller, weaker. It has a smaller list of powers over the states. The federal government basically, or
So
the
would you be in
confederal government, whatever you call it.
so would you be in favor of abolishing the federal government entirely, or would you just want to restructure it into a weaker federal government?
Um, it would, in practice, what is the difference in practice, kind of, because if you abolish it and create a new government immediately, you're going to be using people from the old government in the new government. You're not going to tear down the buildings and
Yeah.
build new ones, things like that. Um, would it require? I mean, is it politically feasible? These are. But you said wave a magic
Yeah,
wand,
yeah,
so
yeah. Like I'm just trying to get a picture of what this looks like because like
what this looks like,
when
yeah.
I gave the example of like the phone call because that's what I was trying to look for, like this dude's idea of a confederacy was like we group different states into regions and then we just make those have regional federal governments and then we still have the state governments that interact. That was this caller's idea of a confederacy.
Well, with a magic wand, you could do it however you wanted. You could have, you could call them states still, or you could have smaller names for things.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Jefferson suggested having the central unit of political structure in the U.S. be the county level,
Mm-hmm.
and people in counties would, in his imagination, all gather together and discuss politics fairly regularly. And you weren't forced to go, but it was really in your best interest to go. And ideally, everyone would go, and they would all discuss, and then they would figure out what to do from there.
Are you familiar with
So,
the idea of the deliberation day?
I've never heard of that particular thing, but I think I can imagine what that
Yeah,
entails.
that's basically what I guess your definition of what Jefferson was suggesting is that sometime before we vote on presidents or any kind of electoral group, we have a day where all people and you'd figure out how to supplement their income losses for the days off of work. You'd gather people in a local meeting area, so like a gym or just anywhere a lot of people can meet, and you try to present to them just kind of the political figures who are running, and then that way you just have some sort of insurance that every voter has some base knowledge about who they're voting for and what the issues are. But then obviously there's so many issues when it comes to like, well, how are you going to present this information in a fair way? Who's going to be presenting the information? How do you do this so people aren't going to be completely slanted towards one candidate over the other? But yeah. Do you have anything else? We're a little over an hour now. Do you have anything else you want to mention real quick, or do you think we've hit all the major points?
Yeah, with the idea of like a confederation, it's important to understand that, in a sense, states are unitary central governments that control their own area, their own geography,
Yeah.
more centrally than the federal government controls the entire federal government. That always is in flux. I'm not entirely sure how true that is anymore with things like the DHS new regulations about border and the fact
Yeah.
that most of the population of the country is within a certain distance from the border. There's
Yeah.
stuff like that you can start talking about, but
Or federal troops going to try to bust protests down in Portland and other states.
well, that's they used that new
Yeah.
regulation in order to do that
Yeah, I guess
because
those are hand in
Portland
hand.
is
Yeah.
close to the border,
Hmm.
and so that raises a lot of questions. But forget all those questions. Um, the idea would be that everyone is free to sort of buck a larger authority than themselves. And then the problem is, if you're in this area and all of a sudden people have voted to, form a new polity, basically, then you say, I don't agree with those people. Now I have to move. So the problem is, like, how do you make sure that everyone can move easily?
Yeah. But then
Right?
it's also like
There's a lot of utopian ideas that you can
yeah,
start throwing out when you
but
start
then it's
talking
kind
about
of like if a bunch of people, if you have such decentralized governments, like I could just imagine like a group of like the first thing I think of is like when a bunch of just like really racist people who just want to discriminate against like all forms of minorities, why wouldn't they just kind of move, create their own states, and then just be able to do whatever they want, and then displace people who are already living in there who are of like minority status? Like it seems like there's some issues that we really need to have a strong central power to come down on like states. Like I don't think that, especially in the civil rights era, like these states weren't really willing to comply with a lot of the standards that the federal government was trying to set, and I feel like these issues would be somewhat impossible if we didn't have a strong central force in our government.
Yeah. I mean, talking about confederations and stuff like that is sort of like talking about defunding the police.
Yeah.
The other
Yep.
side of the coin is a lot more important
Yeah.
than just the slogan
Of
or like
course.
what it
Of
would look
course.
like at the end of the political. In fact, all I'm saying is that we would want to have as little government as we need, which
Yeah.
almost everyone would agree with.
Yeah.
Even people that want a really big government,
Yeah.
they just think that we need that. And frankly, in some ways we do, for
Yeah.
sure. So like Texas or something, people would be like, you want Texas to have all the power, because all the conservative people would make it more conservative, and then all the liberal people would want to leave.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not fair to them, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It gets really complicated, and that wasn't really. I didn't prep for any of that kind of discussion.
Yeah.
I just had a bunch of stuff about language.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, and you think there's anything else you want to bring up? We could probably go for another, 5 or 10 minutes max. I don't want to run this too long, but
You gotta.
I think we hit a bunch of good points here. You think? What do you think? You think there's anything else, or?
It was an interesting conversation for sure. I'd want to bring up, this is a quote from James Horton. He was a professor at George Washington University, and he said, we're a country built on principles literally to die for. Principles that are so wonderful, it brings tears to your eyes. But we're a society that so often allows itself to ignore those principles. We live in a kind of heightened state of anxiety because we know we aren't what we could be or what we say we are. And for me, that encapsulates, for one thing, that in itself is invoking a point that sounds really great, but that people fight over very viciously, right? But it's a nice statement because it's hard to disagree with, really. And if you approach politics from a starting point somewhere around there, and with the implications of quotes like that, the ideas that you get around that are closer to that American patriotic thing that I was talking about. It's sort of rather than having to debate, everything and the kitchen sink, you can just sort of say, okay, we already agree on a lot of stuff. Let's figure out why we seem to disagree, even though it seems like we have the same values. Like the Republican and Democratic parties, they both just want what's best for the country. They just have different ideas about how to get there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do I believe that's actually true? No.
Yeah.
But if we proceed on a ground of good faith argument, basically, which is that we have the same values or very similar values, different priorities, and different, policy ideas, that if we trickle down to I don't know what I'm saying, trickle down. if we go down to the base level and start to build up, I think it might be possible to get more agreement about some of the really, really vital and necessary changes that we need to make very quickly to our political system to make people's suffering, be abated.
Yeah. I always do favor a more compassionate approach, especially when debating politics. If you start with, what do you what do you agree on? What values do you share? Then you can kind of work from then. And I think it's important for people of, very different political ideologies, try to think about the bridge issues that you have. So, say you're super left wing, but maybe you're pro-gun. Okay, well, maybe if you talk to someone who is, a very right-wing conservative who's also pro-gun, then maybe you talk about that and you see how that, and you show them how this thing that they agree on might fit into your political philosophy. And then maybe they'd be more willing to kind of amend some of their other thoughts and agreements or disagreements about theirs into what you have to say.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely. I like to approach everything from a perspective of it's not about winning. It's not about educating the other person. It's about learning from them, actually, and sort of approaching everything with just like a positive mindset and a desire to sort of come together, a connection, rather than sort of trying to defeat them or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, you want to plug any social medias or any websites, any charities, any whatever? I can put it right under your name or just in the description.
Try 8toabolition.com, I think, is a great, I believe that's the name of it. I think it's .com. It's .org. 8toabolition.org. Nope, it's not 8toabolition.org. I think it's .com. Yes. 8toabolition.com, that's the number 8. That's a pretty good source for why people talk about defunding the police and what that would actually look like, and then what would you be doing with the money. Crucially, a really tiny point that I don't think we talked at the beginning about the police is It doesn't mean that all the things that police do would now go undone if you
Yeah.
defunded the police. They would just be different agencies and
Yeah.
organizations and things like
Yeah.
that. Um, and yeah, it is radical. It's not like everyone is going to favor abolition or something like that. I mean, that's really extreme. And we wouldn't need to abolish it to have progress, positive progress be made. So that's that on that. I don't have any, I mean, you can plug all of my social media. That's great. I'm not like doing anything social media
Yeah.
wise that I would have to plug, but
I'll make sure to put it in. Don't worry. Don't worry. Alrighty.
yeah,
Daniel, thanks for coming on. If you want to come on again sometime in the future, if I make a video that you super, wholeheartedly disagree with, maybe come on, yell at me a
you
little
know,
bit. That would be good. I'm trying to get some more debates, but a lot of people don't want to debate me, man. It's rough. It's rough. I'll work something out in the future. We'll see. We need to get some saucy, Luca versus a conservative debates going on, I think.
hmm,
All right, man. Have a great day. Thanks so much for coming on. And
yeah.
yeah, have a good one.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.
Yep. Take care.
You too.